May 3rd, 1999, began as a typical spring day in Oklahoma. Warm air, heavy with humidity, a familiar threat lurking on the horizon. By nightfall, those calm skies would unleash winds measured at an unprecedented 321 miles per hour, making this the deadliest and most violent tornado ever recorded in American history. Meteorologists at the Storm Prediction Center scrambled as forecasts escalated from slight risk before dawn to a dire, high risk by afternoon, setting the stage for a disaster even experts had never fully imagined. But what combination of atmospheric forces could fuel such unimaginable destruction? And how did a single storm forever change the way America prepares for the worst? The answer begins in the uneasy stillness before the first sirens, when the perfect storm was quietly taking shape. By late morning on May 3rd, 1999, the air over central Oklahoma carried all the hallmarks of an explosive spring setup. Temperatures had climbed well into the 80s Fahrenheit, while dew points hovered in the low 70s, a sign that the atmosphere was loaded with moisture pulled straight from the Gulf of Mexico. Meteorologists tracked these numbers closely, knowing that such high dew points meant any rising air would have plenty of fuel to work with. But it was the convective available potential energy, or CAPE, that truly set nerves on edge. Readings soared to between 5,000 and 6,000 joules per kilogram, levels rarely seen outside the most volatile outbreaks. In plain terms, this meant the air was primed for rapid, violent updrafts, perfect for the birth of supercell thunderstorms. Above the surface, a powerful jet stream raced out of the southwest, creating sharp wind shear as it crossed over the warm, humid air below. This combination, warmth, moisture, instability, and changing winds with height, formed what storm chasers call the loaded gun. The ingredients were all present, just waiting for a spark. Across the plains, the landscape simmered under a thick, invisible tension. Even the most seasoned forecasters felt a growing sense of unease as each new data point confirmed that the stage was set for something extraordinary. The atmosphere was holding its breath, caught between calm and chaos, as the afternoon pressed on. At 1:30 a.m., the Storm Prediction Center put out a slight risk for severe storms across Oklahoma. By late morning, forecasters raised the outlook to moderate. The data kept coming in. Unstable air, a roaring jet stream, and dew points that refused to drop. At 3:40 p.m., the SPC issued Tornado Watch number 213, stamped with the words, "Particularly dangerous situation." The text warned, "Tornado outbreak likely. Very large, destructive tornadoes possible." Just 9 minutes later, the risk level was raised again. At 3:49 p.m., central Oklahoma was under a high risk for severe weather, the highest category the SPC uses. The bulletin spelled it out. Conditions were now sufficient for long-lived supercells capable of producing strong and violent tornadoes. Inside the National Weather Service office in Norman, meteorologists like David Andra and Rick Smith watched radar screens and weather models with growing concern. Gary England, on air at KWTV-9, began to sound more urgent, his voice cutting through the afternoon calm. Meanwhile, out on the plains, the Vortex-99 research project was rolling. Scientists Joshua Werman and Eric Rasmussen positioned their Doppler on wheels trucks along likely storm paths, ready to capture data if the worst happened. Their goal was simple: catch a tornado in the act and measure what no one else could. By late afternoon, one storm cell in particular drew the experts' attention. It would soon be labeled Storm A. Every warning, every field report, every anxious glance at the sky pointed to the same conclusion: something historic was about to unfold. At 7:01 p.m., the Doppler on wheels, DOW for short, locked onto the tornado just west of Bridge Creek. Inside the mobile radar truck, Dr. Joshua Werman and his team watched the velocity display surge to numbers never before seen. The raw data showed wind speeds between 301 and 321 miles per hour, less than 100 feet above ground. For context, that's faster than a Formula One car at full throttle, more than enough to tear apart anything in its path. The radar's beam, sweeping through the lowest levels of the storm, caught a slice of the tornado's core as it passed over the Willow Lake addition. The measurements were so extreme that the team paused to double-check for errors, aliasing, debris interference, calibration drift. Each check confirmed the same result. This was, by every standard, the most violent tornado wind ever recorded on Earth. On the ground, the evidence matched the radar's story. Entire homes vanished, leaving only bare slabs and a scatter of household debris. In some places, even the pavement was ripped from the roadbed, exposing raw dirt where asphalt used to be. Cars and trucks were tossed half a mile or more, twisted beyond recognition. Trees were stripped of bark, snapped off at ground level, or gone altogether. These are the hallmarks of an F5 tornado. Total destruction, nothing left standing, nothing left to salvage. The Dow's wind readings didn't just set a new record. They validated what survey teams would find in the aftermath. The hardest hit stretch, where the radar clocked its highest speeds, matched up exactly with the zone of absolute devastation. Scientists later reviewed the data again and again, trying to find any flaw, but the numbers held. The Bridge Creek Moore tornado had rewritten the limits of what a tornado could do. For the people in its path, there was no warning strong enough to capture the scale of what was coming. The science had caught up to the chaos, but the storm was only beginning its rampage through Oklahoma. By early evening, the tornado was no longer just a radar signature or a set of impossible numbers on a scientist's screen. It had become a living nightmare for the families caught in its path. In Bridge Creek, 10-month-old Alea Crago was asleep in her crib when the walls around her began to disintegrate. The tornado ripped her from her home and hurled her more than 100 feet across a muddy field. When rescuers found her, Alea was caked in dirt but somehow alive, her only injuries minor scrapes. Her survival defied logic and became a symbol of hope amid the destruction. Not every story ended as miraculously. Along rural roads and farmsteads, families scrambled for shelter wherever they could find it. On the highway near Newcastle, cars jammed up as people tried to outrun the storm. Some, remembering old advice, abandoned their vehicles and climbed under highway overpasses, believing the concrete would shield them. One of them was Kathleen Walton, who took cover at the Shields Boulevard overpass with her son Levi. When the tornado struck, the wind funneled through the narrow space, turning the overpass into a deadly wind tunnel. Kathleen shielded Levi with her body. She was killed instantly. Levi, battered and dazed, was found alive in the debris downstream. The tragedy at the overpass would later shatter the myth that these structures offer protection. As the tornado roared on, the National Weather Service in Norman faced a decision with no precedent. At 6:57 p.m., forecaster David Ondra issued a new kind of warning. Tornado emergency in South Oklahoma City metro area. This is an extremely dangerous and life-threatening situation. If you're in the path of this large and destructive tornado, take cover immediately. The words were blunt, urgent, meant to jolt anyone still listening into action. For the first time, a tornado warning was escalated to an emergency, aimed directly at the heart of Moore and South Oklahoma City. In the chaos, 6-year-old Jordan Weiss wandered through the ruins of his neighborhood, calling for his mother. She had shielded him from the storm's fury, but was nowhere to be found. Jordan would become one of the faces of the disaster, a reminder of the children whose lives changed in an instant. As the tornado crossed the Canadian River, it showed no signs of weakening. The city of Moore lay directly in its path, with thousands of lives now hanging in the balance. In Regency Park, the tornado's approach left families with only seconds to decide how to survive. Randy and Patty Thurman, along with their 2 children, had no basement, no underground shelter, just the walls of their modest home and whatever cover they could find. As the roar grew louder, they gathered in a narrow hallway closet, pulling a carpet square over themselves. It wasn't armor, but it was all they had. The logic was simple. Hold on. Stay low. Hope the weight of the carpet would keep them from being sucked out into the storm. In those moments, Potty remembers thinking, "We're going to die. We're going to die." The walls shuddered, then vanished. The roof lifted away, and the world turned to wind and noise. When the tornado passed, the Thurmans were still there, clutching each other and the carpet, surrounded by nothing but the slab where their house used to stand. They were shaken, but alive. Everything around them was gone. Just down the block, Doug and Missy Wells made a different choice. After years of watching Oklahoma's storms from a distance, they had installed a reinforced safe room in their garage, a concrete box bolted to the foundation, designed to withstand the unthinkable. As the sirens blared and the air turned heavy, the Wells family crowded inside and pulled the steel door closed. The tornado hit with such force that the rest of their house disintegrated in seconds. When the wind finally died, Doug pushed open the safe room door. The garage was gone. The neighborhood was a field of debris. But the safe room stood, untouched, and the family inside was unharmed. For most and more, there was no time for anything but instinct. Some crawled into bathrooms or bathtubs, clutching pillows and mattresses. Others huddled in closets or under stairwells, hoping the center of the house would hold. The difference between life and death often came down to a few feet or a few seconds. In houses without basements or shelters, families improvised, lying flat, covering themselves with blankets, holding on to anything anchored to the ground. Stories from that night echo with the same refrain: hold on, don't let go, wait for the silence that means it's over. The tornado didn't discriminate. Homes with no shelter were swept clean to the slab, while a handful of reinforced rooms stood as islands of survival amid the wreckage. The Wells family safe room became a symbol, a concrete answer to the question that haunted every survivor. For the Thurmans, survival was a matter of luck, quick thinking, and the weight of a carpet square. Both families would later say that the choices they made in those seconds shaped the rest of their lives. In the aftermath, as neighbors searched for loved ones in the ruins, these stories began to circulate. Reminders that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, small decisions could make all the difference. At 7:20 p.m., the tornado carved into the heart of Moore with a force that overwhelmed every barrier. Neighborhood streets vanished beneath piles of splintered lumber, insulation, and the tangled shells of cars. Kelly Elementary School, a familiar anchor for hundreds of families, lost its roof and much of its structure in seconds. Classrooms where children had practiced tornado drills for years were left open to the sky, their walls buckled, desks scattered like matchsticks. The air filled with the sound of sirens, alarms, and the distant shouts of people searching for loved ones. Across Moore, the city's infrastructure buckled under the storm's assault. Power lines snapped, plunging entire blocks into darkness. Water mains burst, flooding intersections already choked with debris. The main north-south artery, Interstate 35, became a corridor of panic. Traffic had already slowed to a crawl as drivers tried to escape the storm's projected path, but gridlock trapped hundreds in place. As the tornado bore down, some abandoned their vehicles and sprinted for cover. Others huddled in their cars, hoping the reinforced steel and glass would be enough. Many tried to reach the overpasses, still believing the old myth that the concrete spans could shield them. But the wind beneath the bridges only intensified, turning those spaces into deadly wind tunnels. In the Dell Area Edition just east of Interstate 35, families who had taken shelter in their homes faced the full force of the tornado's core. Entire rows of houses were swept clean, leaving bare slabs and scattered personal belongings. The devastation was so complete that emergency crews struggled to find familiar landmarks as they navigated the wreckage in the hours that followed. In Dell City, David and Sandy Henry took shelter in their duplex bathroom as the roar grew deafening. David wrapped himself around Sandy, shielding her with his body, as the walls began to fail. When the storm passed, Sandy was alive, bruised, trapped, but alive. David had absorbed the brunt of the debris and did not survive. His sacrifice became a quiet example of the everyday heroism that played out across the city that night. First responders raced toward the worst-hit neighborhoods, but the tornado's path had made many roads impassable. Downed trees and live wires blocked access. In Del Aire, neighbors dug through the debris with bare hands, searching for anyone who might be trapped beneath the rubble. The tornado had left behind a landscape of heartbreak. Homes erased, vehicles hurled into fields, entire blocks reduced to rubble. As the tornado continued northeast, Moore's municipal heart was left shredded. The city's network of schools, roads, and public spaces had been devastated in less than half an hour. The tornado pressed on, leaving behind a trail of destruction that would stretch into Midwest City and beyond. Sirens faded into the background as the last echoes of the tornado gave way to a new kind of chaos. Within minutes, emergency medical teams, firefighters, and police from across the region began to converge on Moore and Del City. Many roads were blocked by downed power lines and tangled debris, forcing first responders to abandon their vehicles and continue on foot. The Oklahoma National Guard was activated almost immediately, with units mobilizing overnight to help secure neighborhoods and support search operations. Hospitals across Oklahoma City and Norman braced for a wave of trauma patients. Ambulances arrived in a steady stream, carrying the injured from makeshift triage sites set up in parking lots and school fields. By midnight, more than 200 people had been treated for injuries ranging from deep lacerations to crushed limbs and head trauma. The emergency rooms at Norman Regional and Integris Southwest Medical Center filled to capacity, with doctors and nurses working non-stop, some for more than 24 hours straight. Rescue crews picked through the splintered remains of homes, calling out for survivors and listening for faint cries beneath the rubble. In the Del Aire addition, searchers worked by flashlight, sometimes digging with bare hands. Every few minutes, another survivor was pulled from the wreckage, dazed, bloodied, but alive. In some cases, neighbors formed impromptu chains, passing debris hand to hand to clear paths for medics and stretchers. The scale of the destruction forced officials to call in resources from surrounding counties, and by 3 a.m., more than 500 emergency personnel were on scene. The National Guard established checkpoints to prevent looting and to help coordinate the flow of aid trucks and heavy equipment. Portable generators arrived to power floodlights, turning night into day in pockets of devastation. Search dogs were brought in to locate people who might still be trapped under collapsed walls. For many, the first sign of hope came not from the distant wail of sirens, but from the steady, determined voices of rescue workers moving through the darkness. As dawn approached, the full scale of the disaster began to take shape. The work of the night was far from over. For the families still searching for loved ones, and for the responders who refused to rest, the hardest hours were just beginning. By sunrise on May 4th, the devastation in Moore and surrounding communities was only one part of a much larger disaster. Across Oklahoma, the previous 24 hours had brought a historic outbreak. 70 tornadoes confirmed in the state alone, a record unmatched before or since. The Bridge Creek Moore tornado was the deadliest, but it was far from the only one. F4 tornadoes swept through Mulhall and Dover, flattening homes and scattering livestock across the countryside. In Stroud, a powerful F3 destroyed much of the town's business district, leaving a scar that would take years to heal. Kansas was not spared either, with an F4 tearing through the southern suburbs of Wichita and Hayesville, adding to the region's misery. The numbers are staggering. At least 40 people lost their lives in Oklahoma, with 6 more fatalities reported across Kansas and neighboring states as the outbreak continued into the night. Hundreds of families began the day with little more than the clothes they wore, their homes reduced to splintered wood and bare foundations. The Bridge Creek Moore tornado alone accounted for $1 billion in losses. the first time a single tornado reached that threshold. By the end of the outbreak, the total damage across Oklahoma and Kansas neared $1.5 billion, a sum that dwarfed any previous tornado disaster in American history. The scale of destruction was matched only by the grim work of recovery. In the hardest-hit neighborhoods, search teams moved methodically through the debris, often finding bodies days after the winds had died down. In Del Aire, Kara Weiss's remains were discovered in what had once been her living room, her son Jordan found alive nearby. Kathleen Walton and Tramthu Bowie, both killed while seeking shelter at overpasses, were recovered from the tangled wreckage along Interstate 35. Official counts would eventually confirm 36 direct deaths from the Bridge Creek, more tornado, but the emotional toll stretched far beyond the numbers. With entire towns reeling, the need for coordinated action became clear. The disaster had exposed the vulnerability of both rural and urban communities, and the sheer cost demanded a response on a scale few had ever contemplated. As the sun rose over the flattened neighborhoods, the question shifted from survival to how and if these communities could rebuild. FEMA teams arrived in Oklahoma within hours, setting up mobile offices in parking lots and school gyms across Moore, Bridge Creek, and Del City. By July, federal disaster aid reached $67.8 million, money that went toward temporary housing, debris removal, and the long road to rebuilding. The American Red Cross opened emergency shelters in churches and community centers, providing cots, meals, and a place for families to regroup. Volunteers lined up to hand out bottled water and hot meals, while local businesses donated everything from blankets to heavy machinery. For many survivors, the question wasn't just where to sleep that night, but how to protect themselves in the future. The tornado had made one thing clear: standard construction offered little defense against winds over 300 miles per hour. In response, state officials launched a $12 million safe room rebate program, one of the first in the nation. Over the next 4 years, more than 6,000 safe rooms were built across Oklahoma, each one a small concrete fortress anchored to the ground. These shelters offered a new kind of security, not just for homeowners, but for entire neighborhoods. In Moore alone, applications for safe rooms surged as families saw firsthand how a reinforced room could mean the difference between life and death. FEMA officials, working with state and local governments, streamlined the process for disaster aid and safe room funding. Inspectors moved door to door, documenting damage and helping residents file claims. The pace was relentless, but the urgency was real. Summer storms were coming, and people needed somewhere safe to go. Survivors like Doug and Missy Wells, whose safe room had saved their lives, became local advocates, showing neighbors the steel doors and concrete walls that had protected them when nothing else could. Their story, and others like it, helped shift the conversation from despair to action. The impact was measurable. By 2003, thousands of new shelters dotted the Oklahoma landscape, each one a direct result of the lessons learned in the aftermath of May 3rd. Aid and innovation moved hand in hand, turning tragedy into a blueprint for resilience. In the years after the Bridge Creek, Moore Tornado, Oklahoma, became a proving ground for what determined communities, scientists, and policymakers could accomplish together. The lessons of May 3rd, 1999 were not just cataloged. They were put to the test, over and over again. One of the most powerful changes began with how warnings reached people in harm's way. The tornado emergency phrase, first drafted in a moment of crisis by David Andra, is now a standard part of the National Weather Service toolkit. Meteorologists across the country reserve it for only the gravest threats, when a confirmed violent tornado targets a populated area. The urgency is clear, and so is the impact. In the years that followed, hundreds of lives have been credited to these no-nonsense alerts. On average, residents in Moore and surrounding communities now receive about 32 minutes of lead time before a tornado strikes, twice the national average in 1999. That extra time means more families can reach shelter, more schools can get children to safety, and more emergency plans can be set in motion. But warnings alone are not enough. The Safe Room Initiative, seeded by survivor stories and backed by state and federal funding, changed the landscape of tornado safety. In just 4 years after the disaster, more than 6,000 safe rooms were built in Oklahoma homes. By 2003, another violent tornado tracked almost the same path as the 1999 storm. This time, no one died. Families who had installed safe rooms, many with help from the rebate program, walked out unscathed, even when their houses were swept away. Doug Wells and his family survived both events in the same reinforced shelter, living proof that preparation matters. Moore's adoption of tornado-specific building codes in 2014 set a new national precedent. Every new home must now withstand winds up to 135 miles per hour. Builders pushed back, arguing about cost, but public testimony from survivors swayed the city council. The codes faced their own trial by fire in Chapter 115, when another tornado struck Moore. Not a single death occurred in any house built to the new standard. The evidence was undeniable. Stronger buildings save lives. The scientific legacy of May 3, 1999 reaches far beyond Oklahoma. Data from the Doppler on wheels, collected by Joshua Werman and the VORTEX-99 team, became the backbone for new research into tornado structure and intensity. That research drove advances in radar technology, warning systems, and even the way meteorologists communicate risk. Today, phased array radars and storm-based warnings draw a direct line back to the chaos and discovery of that spring evening. Survivors like Jordan Wise and Levi Walton have taken their stories public, urging others to take tornado warnings seriously and to invest in real shelter. Their advocacy, combined with scientific progress and political will, has helped save an estimated 600 lives since 1999, each one a testament to what can be accomplished when tragedy is met with action. The scars of May 3rd remain, but so does a blueprint for survival. On May 3rd, 1999, the Bridge Creek Moore tornado became the first in U.S. history to cause over $1 billion in damage, with Doppler on wheels recording wind speeds up to 321 miles per hour, the highest ever measured. In just 85 minutes, the storm destroyed more than 8,000 homes and took 36 lives, despite the efforts of forecasters who issued the first ever tornado emergency. Many questions remain, including why even the strongest built homes could not withstand the storm's peak winds, and how some survivors endured when others did not. In the years since, stronger building codes, the installation of over 6,000 safe rooms, and improved warning systems have saved hundreds of lives in Oklahoma. Today, every tornado warning and reinforced shelter is a direct result of lessons learned from May 3rd, 1999. The legacy of that night is not just in loss, but in the lasting changes that continue to protect communities across the country.